Alrighty guys, welcome back to another one. In today's video, we're going to be going over what I think are absolute must-have upgrades for the Leloadall. We'll start off with the relatively minor things, modifications I've done to make them work a little bit better. So, getting right into it, this right here, I'm surprised no one's ever asked about this, but what it is I have took a Dremel and cut out a hunk of plastic really to accommodate space for stuff like roll crimp tools. I'm trying to dig this out of here. This one is my BPI 10 gauge roll crimp tool. Now I don't use the BPI roll crimp tools anymore. I have switched to the Reloaders Network or GOP because to be honest they work a lot better. These will do just fine and they are cheaper, but the other ones just work a whole lot better. But this is where I stored my roll crimp tools. I gave them all to Josh. He doesn't have a 10 gauge, so I ended up keeping mine, but he has the rest of them. I also used to keep things like random loose slugs. I have just 2 or 3 of them. Put them in here. I used to keep sockets in here because I used to use sockets to help me get nicer crimps on certain gauges, but not anymore. But that was basically storage for stuff like that, roll crimp tools and such. This one was my large bore crimper storage, 10, 12, 16. And over here on this side, it was for my small bore, 20, 24, 28, 32, 410. There's also apparently 20 cents in there. It looks to be, yeah, 20 cents. I don't know why that's in there, but it is. And if you didn't know, this is just empty space underneath here. I'm surprised Lee doesn't window this out themselves because it is just quite a bit of empty space underneath your press. You can see, I'll get you a better view. Don't mind the dirt. I actually use my presses a lot, so there's going to be loose powder and some debris laying around. But yeah, all that empty space under there, I figured why not take advantage of it and use it as storage. So one other thing I've done, this isn't really a modification, but I do highly suggest picking a few of these up. These right here are the retainer rings clips for the bars on the Leloadall. Now, when I first started reloading for 12 and 16 gauge, I used this press so much, me and Josh both did, that we wore out the clips and they popped off their focus. Come on, right there. You can see the clip right here. They popped off both arms and we'd have to hold them on. I switched to using masking tape for a while and that didn't work that long, so went ahead and bought me some new retaining clips, and occasionally they do pop off. It only happens like once a year. They do wear out though. So, just a word of advice here, I'd go ahead and stock up on a few, and my solution to never lose them was just to tape them to the top of the press right here. Now, inside the top of the press, you're supposed to keep your bushings in here, your shot and powder bushings, but I never use those. The only time I ever use my bushings is when I'm loading the clay rounds we do. Sometimes we do reload shoot clays, mainly in the weirder gauges like 24, 32, stuff like that. But that's the only time I really use the bushings for, shot and powder. So I keep everything in here besides the shot and powder bushings just because I don't want to lose them. These things are easy to lose. Thankfully, I've never lost any of them. What I have in here are two 12 gauge rings because I have more than one press. This one's 16. There's my 20 gauge ring. I have a 20 gauge ring underneath this one. There's my 16 gauge ring and my 12 gauge ring. That top one, I'll get to that in just a moment. It's 10 gauge. And in here, I have Mech crimp starters. This one's for 10 gauge. I don't use it that often because, well, I'll talk about that in just a moment. This one is 28 gauge. This one's 24 gauge. It was a 28 gauge crimp starter, but I took out the little, for lack of a better term, tabs. There's 3 of them in here. I took those out with a knife and then used sandpaper to open this up a little bit to fit 24 gauge, and this is what I now was using to pre-crimp my 24 gauge, but again, that's something I'll talk about here in just a moment. This one is for 20 gauge. I thought that this would work better for 24 gauge, but it didn't. So that one's totally useless now, as are the 28 and 24s that I have. I don't use these three anymore at all. I do still use the 10 gauge one on occasion though. Most of the time, instead of using the powder bushings the presses come with, I use this. It is a Lee Perfect powder measure. I use that, thanks Gary for sending it, because the bushings that come with the press, they're only rough estimations. I wouldn't say rough. They're approximate charges. They have a chart that shows you what each bushing throws of a given powder, but every powder is different. Let's say you have a bottle of Long Shot. You use it for 6 months, you run out of it, you get another bottle. Well, that same bushing you've been using may throw a slightly different charge. It could be off by an entire grain sometimes. So you always got to check that with your scale to make sure your bushings are throwing what you want them to throw. So, a little bit of inaccuracy with those. This is what I use now. And for what it's worth, that is not just a problem with the Lee Lodahl. All presses have that issue. All presses that have charge bars. That is just an issue they'll all have because, again, powder weights can vary lot to lot, bottle to bottle. It's just how it is. For example, Long Shot, the Lee 2.2 cc dipper right here, it always threw right at 29 grains for my first bottle of Long Shot. Every bottle of powder I've bought since then of Long Shot has been between 27.5 and 29.5. Powder can fluctuate that much in weight. Now to move on to more serious modifications. That was an accident. I don't even remember how I did that. It might not have even been me. I don't remember. But the final crimp tube. All of my presses besides this one have a 1/4 inch trimmed off the length of the final crimp tube. And to do that, not to do that, but why I've done that is to be able to crimp 2.5 inch shells. Sometimes you have a hull that, let's say a 2 3/4 inch 12 gauge, the crimp splits on you, but not bad enough to where the rest of the hull is unusable, so you trim it down to a 2.5. Well, the Lee Lodahl cannot normally crimp 2.5 inch shells. In order to do that, just trim off 1/4 inch of the final crimp tube, and the press does have enough throw at that point to actually fold crimp 2.5 inch shells. The pre-crimp tubes already have enough clearance downwards to put a pre-crimp on them. No need to modify those. But to be able to crimp the 2.5 inch shells, you also need to have your press as far forward on your bench, or in my case, dresser, as you can possibly go. The top of this is about, I don't know, 3/4 inch thick. It's not quite an inch, but it is solid wood. It's not press board or plywood or hollow. It is actual solid wood. This is a veneer though. But underneath it is solid wood. I think it's just maple. I'm not sure. It looks like maple. But you can see this press right here it's a lot farther forward than this press is. This one, doesn't matter what gauge you have it set up in, cannot crimp 2.5 inch because I accidentally set it too far back on my dresser. The handles do not have enough downward throw to be able to crimp a 2.5 inch shell. This one, however, does. So when I do load 2.5 inch, which is not often, I do use this press, not this one. Some of you may have noticed the screw right here on this press and the screw on this one here. And to explain those, well, the Lee Lodahl can become worn out over time. We had loaded thousands of rounds on this press right here, and, well, we wore it out. The bottom of this is plastic, although it's really heavy-duty plastic. The beam can waller it out a little bit, and it becomes loose. Another reason why it becomes loose is because right here, I would show you, but it'd be really hard to do. There's a screw right here that holds the main beam to the press. That screw happens to be made of steel. This is aluminum. Do you know what happens whenever you use or rub steel against aluminum long enough? It wallers the aluminum out, making the hole larger in diameter and weaker. If you're wondering what that hole is, that's just where the wad guide was originally. But I don't use my wad guides anymore, so I just left it off. I could drill a new hole in the back of this and reattach my wad guide, but again, I don't use it, so I have not done that. Here's the original hole. Here's one I drilled for 3.5-inch shells. When I have this set up in 10 gauge, I can put the wad guide right here, or yeah, right here, and use it as a, well, 3.5-inch press. 10 gauge target wads are still small enough to where they'll feed through a 12 gauge wad guide just fine, and 3.5-inch 12 gauge, obviously the wads will go through that just fine. But anyway, what I've done is, again, I'll try to show you. Yeah, you can kind of see the screw right there in the middle of the screen. But that is a much longer screw. It runs all the way through this and ends about right here. So the screw is through both sides of the beam, not just one side, so that creates a lot more stability. This screw right here, well, I told you earlier that the plastic became worn out. It became worn out mostly on this side, probably because I pulled out with my left hand. When I do that, I may be inadvertently pulling it to the left too, just a little bit, and then it caused it to wear out on this side. So that screw is in there for added support. This thing is rock solid. I'm moving my entire dresser right now, and the press is not moving at all. The top of it will still move. You need that movement to properly line up with your shells. So, with the longer screw run through the back of it and both sides of the beam and that screw right there, this thing is absolutely rock solid, just like a mech would be. And I've done the same thing with this press. It has a long screw through the back of it. Again, it ends right before this hole starts, so you can't really see the screw. But it is through both sides of the beam, and that screw right there is, again, for added stability. This press also will not rock at all. It's just moving my dresser. This broken guitar pick here, I super glued that in place before I added the screw and added the longer screw through the beam for, again, added stability, but it didn't really work too well. It's super glued in place, so it's just going to live there. Side note here, that's a Hetfield Black Fang Metallica. The last thing I've done to actually modify the presses before, well, let's call it significantly modifying them, is underneath this. That is a primer catcher, spent primer catcher. Right now I have live primers in it because I was depriming old shells I had loaded. Well, that is a very, very handy thing to have, because without it, you can see when you knock your primers out of your shells, they're just going to fall loosely in here, and you have to scrape them out by finger, which can be challenging, especially the ones way in the back that get stuck behind this right here. Yeah, they fall in behind here, and they're really hard to dig out. What I do is I get a magnetic screwdriver and pull them out with a magnet. But, again, tedious. This right here catches all of your spent primers for you, or in my case, live primers here. But that is awesome. This was sent to me by Martin, if I remember right. I've been using it for months. These are made by Avid Waterfowler here on YouTube. Go check his channel out. He 3D prints these. He actually sent me quite a few more of them. I am absolutely shocked that Lee does not send one of these in the boxes with their presses as a standard inclusion. They don't do that. And I'm also shocked that, as far as I can tell, no company, aftermarket company, makes these for the Lee. People have been making them themselves for years, but now Avid Waterfowler actually has them regularly available. If you guys want one of these, I highly suggest going over to his channel and getting a hold of him there. Now, to speak about major modifications, in this case a complete conversion, you can take a 12 gauge Lee Load-All and convert it to load 10 gauge. So this is a fully functional 10 gauge Lee Load-All press. Now obviously you can't deprime 3.5-inch holes with the regular depriming station. You have to punch them out by hammer, or I have this bolt-on depriming punch that was made by a friend of mine, Jim Akers, and this deprimes 16 gauge all the way up to 3.5-inch 10 gauge. It's mainly intended to deprime 3.5-inch shells without having to use a punch and hammer. This just, as you can see, bolts right onto the press. It gets in the way of absolutely nothing, and it lets you deprime your stay with 3.5-inch shells on the press without issues. So the only thing I've done to this press, besides trimming off 1/4 inch of the final crimp tube for 2.5-inch shells, is I have taken a Dremel and opened up the final crimp tube enough to fit 10 gauge shells. That way I could crimp 10 gauge on this. The pre-crimp tubes are completely unmodified. They do fit a 10 gauge shell, although it is a little bit tight, and they work just fine as 10 gauge pre-crimpers. You can do 8-point crimps on a 10 if you want to, which no one ever really does that. I mainly just use the 6-point. The wad ram is unmodified. Again, I don't really use them that often. The primer seating punch, or ram, is unmodified. This station, the depriming and resizing station, unmodified. To resize my 10 gauge shells, I use a Mech 10 gauge resize ring and a piece of PVC pipe to act as a spacer underneath the resize ring over the hull. That way the actual press has enough clearance or downwards throw to be able to properly resize those. The depth of this right here is too short for a 3.5-inch shell. You'll end up crushing the shell if you try to deprime regularly. That's what this is for. If you don't know, the Lee Lodahl is only capable of depriming up to a 3-inch shell, resizing 2. But if you want to do 3.5-inch on it, you will need, for 12 gauge, a second resize ring, or one resize ring and a piece of PVC pipe big enough around. It only has to be about an inch tall to fit over a 12 gauge shell, or 10 gauge. And this piece right here sits underneath the bolt-on depriming punch. Whenever you pull the press down, the punch will kick the primers out, and the hole right there is what they fall through. This just attaches the same way the primer covered door attaches on a press that, you would normally use. If I can get it in there. That little pin right there is there on purpose. What that does is acts as a slide to kick the primers back up into the press. That way they're not just binding up inside right here. So Jim is an absolute genius for coming up with this and this. He made this himself, like completely handmade. And it is awesome, and it works very, very well. The next major upgrade would be the OMV or GOP Rabasator dies. This is what they look like. This is the 28 gauge one. These I should say, are the secret to getting factory looking crimps on brand new hulls. The Lee Lodahl does a pretty good job with new hulls, as does the Mech. I actually think the Lee does a little bit better job on them, to be honest. But this right here, after the final crimp tube, this is used to create a crease. Pretend this is the top of the shell. It creates a crease around the rim of the shell. It domes it in a little bit, and that crease is what holds the crimp memory. Having a nice deep crease in the hull allows for, in my opinion, just unmatched crimps. And to give you an example of what that does, you can see this is a very deep set crimp. There's no pinhole. It's completely even. And the top of it, it's not wavy at all. And this was just done on a Lee Lodahl using the 16 gauge OMV, or actually it's the GOP Rabasator tool, and then just straight up fold crimp. I have not done anything special with this. No GOP BN2 or any sort of crimp finisher. It's not tapered, as you can see. But it does have a flawless crimp on it. Here's one for the 10 gauge. I've done this on the 10 gauge at Lee Lodahl, and it looks like this, another perfect crimp. And it's very, very consistent. Just about like 99% of the time, you use the OMV or GOP or Rabassators and just crimp on a Lee Lodahl or any press for that matter. You end up with factory looking crimps almost every single time. There's like 1% that doesn't come out absolutely perfect, but still, even then, it's really, really good nonetheless. And these things come in all gauges. I have 8 of them: 10, 12, 16, 20, 24, 28, 32, and 410 bore. Yep, got all of them. What's cool, that's the 10 gauge right here. Nope, that's 24. Where is it? Right here. The 410 Rabasator tool from OMV, they label it as a 36 gauge. You can see right there. It says Rib 36. Outside of America, and even sometimes in America, 410 is labeled as 36 gauge, 12 millimeter, 12 millimeter European, 410. Another upgrade is the GOP or OMV crimp starters. These come in every gauge, even 8, a total of 9 different gauges. These attached the same way to the press by use of rubber freeze expansion plugs. If you're just loading the main 3, 12, 20, 16 gauge, well, these aren't really needed because, to be honest, the pre-crimp tubes that are attached to the press are very, very good. Much better than a mech, in my opinion. They do really nice pre-crimps. You couldn't really ask for better, to be honest. But if you want better, the Guyper OMV crimp starters work wonders. So, if you have anything other than 12, 20, and 16 gauge, you can use these to pre-crimp those gauges. The only company that makes a 24 or 32 gauge press is Ponsness Warren on a custom order, but they do make them. But those presses are very, very expensive, but worth it. It's probably the best shot shell reloading press on the market. But with this tool right here, you don't have to buy that press. Just attach it to your Leload-All, crimp your small bore gauges, I would say, sub gauges with these right here, and you'll have, again, a factory looking crimp at the end. Now, normally 24 and 32 gauge are not done with roll crimps like ever at all, but OMV and GOP do make the tools that are necessary if you want to do that. So I don't have a press for 24, 28, 32, or 410, or technically even 10 gauge, although I did convert a Leload-All, as you guys know. But these right here allow me to fold crimp all of those gauges without needing a press. So what I do is get the shell loaded with whatever I am wanting to load, use the pre-crimp, and then I do the middle crimp, or I call it the middle crimp. I use the Rabacitor, and then I finish the crimp with a GOP BN2, BN3, BN4, but you can get, again, factory looking crimps using the GOP or OMV crimp starters, the Rabacitors, and the crimp finishers, all of which altogether will be a lot less than buying a press. Basically, I can load 8 different gauges on one press. I forgot to mention this earlier, but one more thing I've done to add a lot of stability to the press, I added a screw here. Now, normally these only have 3 spots where you could use screws to attach them to whatever you're attaching them to. Again, this is a solid top dresser. This screw is a 3-inch long deck screw. It's all the way through it, and we have incredible stability. This is not ever going to come off the dresser or your loading bench, whatever you want to call it. I did that over here too. Another big upgrade you can do is get this is nylon, taper die off of eBay. These are pretty cheap. They're made in Ukraine, and again, just like those other tools I showed you, they are friction fit. You slide them up into either one of the pre-crimp tubes, and what that does is puts a really good taper on the hull. So you can see this one right here. This is a original compression formed Winchester AA, but it doesn't have much of a taper on it at all. And this is what it does. You pull down, and then that gives us a really nice taper. Somehow I forgot to mention this earlier when I was talking about the GOP or OMV crimp tools. Well, you can load any length hull you want with those. This is a 2.5-inch 410. Here's what the crimp looks like. This one is what I was talking about, the weird sizes. This is 2 3/4-inch 410. You can see the difference in heights right there. Yeah, this is 2 3/4-inch 410. There is no press, as far as I know, that can do a 2 3/4-inch 410, but you can certainly do it using the Leload-All and the OMV/GOP crimp tools. One last thing I want to mention before signing this off is you can actually get these piston, for the lack of a better term, to replace the springs in the Leload-All, making it near silent to use. I'll give you an example of that in action. Listen to this press right here whenever I pull down. That noise is the spring being compressed. Now check this out. I'll replace the spring in there with this. Alright, so I have the top off the press. All you do is pull the spring out, dump the follower out. I'm going to set the spring aside here and put this in it. This end goes upside down or downwards for the screw that you would have here normally for the wad guide. That cutout is to sit over top the screw, but how it works, you just slide it in there and it's good to go. So now I have it installed. Listen to it now. Near silent. I will say though, I don't personally prefer the piston over the spring. It's a little bit weird to get used to because the press does come back up slower. It's not spring powered, it's air powered. Pretty cool upgrade nonetheless. But guys, that is pretty much all of the modifications or upgrades I've done or use on my Lelodolls. They are very, very cool tools to have, very handy, very useful, and I highly recommend all of them. But that'll be the end of this one here. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.